Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to Ellensburg, Washington, USA. Glad you could join us. The local time is 5:48 p.m. and we will begin our program on British Columbia geology at 6 p.m. So glad you could join us. Let's see, how are we doing on framing? I think we can come down a little bit. We still need a little bit of blue sky, or sky at least. I've had a record number of emails over the last few days, and a number of them were talking about how to fix wind noise and things. You know, we had our Frenchman Coulee trip. So I've been kind of working on that. Haven't used it yet, so you're in the cardboard box and the blankets and the foam. But I do have an immediate question for you. I did make one adjustment. I hit a button in the settings on this phone. So does the audio sound any different to you? I turned off stereo audio, whatever the hell that is. And a couple YouTube tutorials suggested that was a good thing to do. So does it sound the same? Same as before, which is what I'm hoping you'll say? You don't notice a difference? Sounds the same? Question mark? Okay. We are doing a field trip on Thursday, and I see. I'm playing with different things to put over the little microphone. In fact, I talked to Liz about it, and she's like, well, we got a bunch of actual cat hair. And we got a baggie full of bijou cat hair that, I don't know. I've ordered a couple things online, but I don't know how quickly they'll come. So I might be using double-sided tape and taking a huge clump of bijou hair and put it over the microphone. Anyway, that's not for tonight. So I assume we're doing okay here, video, audio-wise, and I won't think about it again unless I see problems. Mike says the audio is great. That's good enough for me. So we'll have a mixture of sun and clouds today. The English oak is swaying, but I'm going to lose that battle again. Oh well. I think more or less this will work just fine. Say a couple of quick highs to people, hellos to people, and then we will. I've got a couple thank yous. Hello, Evelyn, age 7. Prince George, BC. That's fun. New Hampshire, San Diego, Monroe, Washington. Hello, brother Nick. Tacoma, Renton, Australia. Not Kathy, somebody else. In Brisbane. Kathy's in Brisbane. Leedsburg, Florida. Hello, Patrick, age 7. Osland, Abilene, Texas. Thousand Oaks, California. Washougal. Zazu is always checking in from Belgium. Wonderful to see. Palo Alto. Okanagan, BC. Oh, I'm happy to see some BCers. Nova Scotia, any Canadians really, in addition to our normal crowd. Or actually, we've had a growing number of BC viewers, which is wonderful. Tohoku, there you are. Hello. Palo Alto, USGS, huh? Wow. Okay, nice. Missouri, Tucson. Yeah, so we just lost the sun. Well, this will be interesting. We're at probably, I don't know, sustained 25-mile-an-hour winds, 20, 25 mile an hour. Actually, I don't need to be that low. We're not going to use the board that much. Okay, couple thank yous quick. So John and Chris from Tonasket, they sent another beautiful piece. This is some jade that they cut from the Okanagan in northern Washington. Actually, you can just barely. That's good. That's good. Thank you, John and Chris. On a package up at school from Bob in Wenatchee. Bob, thank you so much. I've always heard about this book, and I've never seen it. Routes and Rocks. I assume it's out of print. It may not be out of print, but this is obviously an original. Roland Tabor. What's the age on this? Always heard about it, never seen it in the flesh. June 1965. I will treasure this, Bob, and use it as I do more and more with the North Cascades. So thank you very much for your generosity. The challenge is to not have everything fly away, so give me an extra second. I got all sorts of rocks as paperweights here. Linda from Seattle sent a nice card to Liz to thank Liz for her patience with all of this, and it's from many of the regulars that have been joining us, so thank you, Linda. That was very kind. And a big old box that says fragile, fragile, fragile. So, bottle of wine. A very special thank you card from Susan in Gifford, Washington. And you're like, I thought I knew Washington pretty well. I don't know where Gifford is. And I kind of asked myself, do I know where Gifford is? Well, I didn't have to think too hard about it, because Susan took this piece of slate, maybe phyllite, and painted on it. So that's where Gifford is, and that's where Ellensburg is. Thank you, Susan. I will treasure this as well. And the wine that she sent is from Lake Roosevelt Wine Company. And Liz has already sampled and did the big thumbs up. Give me a big thumbs up and subscribe down below, and I'll see you at the next video. And so we'll do a toast with this tonight, Susan. If I can have the bottle not blow over. And if I can have Kathy's wine glass not blow over. So thanks as always for the gifts. They always make me slightly uncomfortable, but I know that you feel a need to reciprocate somehow, and I appreciate it. I certainly don't expect it from everybody, but it's very nice. Thank you. Yeah, it's a pretty strong wind. I think I am going to ask one more time. Are we doing okay? Delay in the comments. Kathy in Brisbane says fine. Matt says doing good. All good. 5 by 5. Okay, good. I won't think about it again. I got 2 minutes according to my watch. Give me a couple of minutes to get my brain right, to get my mentals right, and we shall begin. Thanks for joining us. Whoa. You're good. You're good. Oh, shit. My God, this thing fell. It didn't break. I guess it is windy. I can't even find the third one of these little pedestal deals. So I think this is this episode of Nick from Home brought to you by Mova Globes, M-O-V-A. They take a licking and keep on ticking, all right? Oh God, the third one is 20 yards downwind. Well, a pleasant good evening to you all. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm so glad that you could join us. It's the top of the hour and we are beginning right now. My name is Nick Zentner. I teach at the college here in town. It's called Central Washington University. And we continue with these live streams from home. We're here in the backyard to talk about British Columbia geology. Question mark? I'll explain in just a second. To get us into the topic, and to enjoy this amazing province that's to the north of me. So Ellensburg, Washington, where you're looking live right now, is at the Star. And I just Googled it. It's a 7-hour drive from Ellensburg to Kamloops. So 7 hours gets me easily across the border into some interesting geology. But let's back up and try to give you a sense of what I'm hoping to do tonight with you. It's an unusual episode, number one. But I think before I do that, I want to give you a couple of very quick stories. I hope that they're quick. I intend them to be quick. May of 2016, I was on a very big field trip. And the field trip was 100 geologists from across the country, a couple of folks from other countries. It was a Geological Society of America field trip in the channeled scablands. It was an Ice Age floods field trip. And I'd been to many of those places, but I wanted to hear directly from Vic Baker. So you might recognize that name. He led the trip, University of Arizona. He's probably in his 70s by now, but he's still active. And Vic was leading the trip. He was featured in that Nova special. If you're an older person, you still watch television and you watch Nova. And there was a Mysteries of the Mega Floods episode that featured J. Harlan Bretz, of course, but they also followed Vic Baker around in his kind of khaki hat and his Indiana Jones hat and his khaki and his beard, Steamboat Rock, that sort of thing. And so we're on this field trip, May of 2016. And, you know, I don't know if you've been on a field trip like that, but, it's like a dozen vans. Everybody's getting off, getting on. Takes a while to get everybody out of the vans and onto the field outcrop. And Vic talks for a while, and then there's some discussion among everybody. And sometimes there's really interesting questions. Sometimes there's kind of dumb questions, even among geologists, Some are thinking really broad. Some are very, very narrow, Just every kind of color of the rainbow there, basically. But on maybe the third day, I just have a distinct memory of a field stop, and Vic was talking, and we were overlooking Grand Coulee Dam. So we're at that viewpoint just to the west of Grand Coulee Dam, and we're talking about the Canadian ice sheet. We're talking about the Okanagan lobe, how thick the ice was, and talking about Moses Coulee. We had just been in Moses Coulee and how difficult it is to explain Moses Coulee in central Washington, way down here. And about halfway through Vic's spiel, he kind of just paused and said, well, Jerome, you want to talk to these guys? I mean, you've done a bunch of work up there. Up there meaning the Okanagan, up there meaning the Okanagan on the British Columbia side, up there meaning working with landforms at the base of the Canadian ice sheet, the Cordilleran ice sheet. And Jerome was from Canada. And I hadn't talked to him up until that point on the trip. But he was so eloquent, and he said all sorts of interesting things about the enormity of the ice sheet. Let me show you a quick sketch. So he didn't have this with him at the time, but here's Washington, and here's the maximum extent of the most recent glacial advance of the Cordilleran, or the Cordilleran ice sheet, covering all of British Columbia. And the thing that really stuck with me as we're standing there, and Jerome's talking to our group of mostly U.S. folks, is he said, are you really telling me that there isn't a bunch of water coming over Washington from this ice sheet? There's a hell of a lot of ice up there. In places, the ice sheet is miles thick. There has to be a bunch of water coming directly from underneath this ice sheet, as opposed to the more conventional story of only Missoula water. In other words, only water from Glacial Lake Missoula. So as opposed to ice age flood water coming kind of laterally, in other words, along latitude, Jerome's talking about water coming from the north. So my reaction standing there was like, of course, why hadn't I thought of that before? And I don't think I'd really kind of carefully looked at the scale of this ice sheet. I mean, I kind of knew it, but I never really thought about it. And so that was my first time I thought, I got to get up to British Columbia. I just can't keep saying I will at some point. Now, this is 4 years ago. But that was my first major thought. I need to get up there and learn about British Columbia geology, to learn a little bit more about how to best interpret what we have down here in eastern Washington as far as the Missoula floods, the Bretz floods, the Spokane flood, etc. Flash forward, 2 years later, my other quick little story, I was putting together a brand new lecture for downtown. It's on YouTube. It's called Exotic Terrains of the Pacific Northwest. I'm still ticked off at the quality of the filming of that lecture, but whatever, I'll try to get past it. The audio's terrible, the lighting's terrible, blah, blah, blah. But the content I thought was pretty good. But as I was putting that Exotic Terrains lecture together, Baja, BC, I was so Washington-centric and trying to work the best I could with all of these exotic terrains in northern Washington, north of Chelan, up to Tonasket, up to Oroville, up to Ross Lake, up to North Cascades National Park. And I was having a hard time. And what I really needed, and I think I even said by email to a couple of the geologists that I was working with, who were very generous with their time, I kept saying, God, if I could see the terrains underneath this lava, the German chocolate cake, I basically said to these guys, I think I would understand these exotic terrains in this Baja, BC much better if we never had all this German chocolate cake or this cow pie that's all over this map. It's covering all the good stuff up if we're talking about these exotic terrains and this idea of Baja, BC, where large sections of crust, exotic terrain material, were originally in Mexico and are now up here. And one email in particular, the guy said, well, how about why don't you just go up to British Columbia? It's all there. It is called Baja, BC, British Columbia. Like, the terrains are there. You don't have to squint through all the basalt lava. And so that was the second major moment for me to say, I need to get up to British Columbia. And so I'm serious about it this time. I'm not talking anymore. I'm going this summer if the borders open up. So this is an unusual live stream because I'm going to ask for help. So I know hardly anything about British Columbia geology, and it takes some cojones to set up a live lecture and expect people to tune in and listen to a guy who doesn't know what he's talking about. I realize that takes a little bit of guts. But I've never been that interested in looking pretty or looking cool or looking smart or anything else, obviously. I got no problem with that. And I'm out to lunch with the geology on that map. I don't even really know the places very well. Prince George, Prince Rupert, Kamloops, Penticton. I mean, I've barely been up the Okanagan. I've barely been to Yoho National Park once. Kootenay National Park once. Vancouver itself, Vancouver Island once. And so before you click this thing off, like, what? You don't know anything and you're going to keep talking? Here's my plan. I want to set the stage with what I feel good about in Washington, look at British Columbia through the same lens. I at least know some equivalent names and some equivalent time frames. And this is basically a follow-up to our last live stream. If you joined us on Sunday, we had a Pacific Northwest Tectonics lecture. I've still got that whiteboard. So we're going to look at that again. We're going to cross the border, ask some of the same questions, and look at the same basic timeline on the other side of the border. And then, we're not going in the Cozy Fort. We're going to you. Some of you are from BC. I hope Jerome Lessman is with us, the guy I was talking about that was so eloquent at the overlook of Grand Coulee Dam. I asked him if he could join us. Maybe you've seen his name already. So you might be able to ask Jerome, who knows way more than just Pleistocene geology of British Columbia. He teaches at Vancouver Island University. Vancouver Island University. A gift from Jerome. We had him down here in Ellensburg. He's here? Good. Okay. Thank you for joining us, Jerome. So this is particularly loose. I'm normally loose, but I'm really loose tonight. And my hope is that when we do live Q&A, it's going to be a little bit of question. If I can catch Jerome's answers to some of your questions, you might even be asking Jerome directly, that's fine. But in addition to the question and maybe a little bit of answer from our Canadian expert, our British Columbia geology expert tonight, I think I'm also looking for tips. Now, Jerome offered to have me drive. It was going to be Jerome and I driving from Wenatchee up into central BC last summer, and then I had some personal stuff back in Wisconsin. Didn't happen. The plan is for Jerome and I to start in Stehekin and then head our way north again in August. Hopefully, we're keeping our fingers crossed that will work. And so Jerome definitely has some places to show me. He spent multiple days in the field with Randall Carlson, by the way. But I want to open it up to more than the Ice Age. I want to open it up more than Baja, BC. But I have to do something. I can't just completely just stare into the camera and say I don't know anything. I know a couple things. And that's what I want to share with you. Okay, so maybe 15, 20 minutes of me, and then tips and questions, and Jerome is involved somehow, possibly. Maybe other British Columbia geologists are with us tonight, and we can just kind of have this be an active workshop. That's the plan. Hope it works for you. We have almost 1,000, so hopefully most of you will stick around. Okay. So our last live stream was Sunday morning, and I've been surprised at how many of you were very pleased with that one. So great. So that motivated me to go right back to this since it seemed to work quite well. And this is a review, a very quick review from the major points that we discovered together on Sunday morning in the front porch. We introduced Baja, BC, which was a major controversy, now is a minor controversy. And what I mean by that is more and more geologists see the evidence for this now. There's multiple lines of evidence, not just one, that suggests that a major section of crust that used to be in Baja, Mexico is now in British Columbia. And the key dates here, these are in millions of years ago, the key dates are between 85 and 60 million years ago. We're doing this movement of almost 2,000 miles. I'm sorry, I don't have kilometers for you tonight. I should. To get this material from the south to the north. Let me give you a quick visual in case this is a brand new concept for you. Hang on, hang on, hang on. Hang on, Patrick. 85 to 60. So we take, it's not as simple as this. We have not found a major San Andreas fault-like structure that does all this movement. And if this is the first you've heard of something like this, you are like absolute baloney, bull hockey, whatever you want to call it. There's no way. Well, if you crunch the numbers on how much time we're talking about, and then you talk about how much movement we have of blocks of crust on the San Andreas Fault today in the last 20 million years, it all works out. This is not science fiction. And this is not a live stream talking about Baja, BC details, and we've already done that. But we are talking about a substantial portion of British Columbia is Mexican crust. It's not just Mount Stewart north of Ellensburg. So I want to come back to that in just a second. What do I have here? Well, sure, why not, since I'm on these pages. So here's 70 million years ago. This is from Darrell Cowan, University of Washington. He's got this big block cartoonishly, and he agrees it's not a simple big block like this, but at least gets the concept across. And here's that Mexican crust, which used to be in Baja, that's now making up westernmost British Columbia, including Vancouver Island. Go Bears. What? More coming on that in a second. I'm going to pick up the pace. We had something called Siletzia, a huge, large igneous province off the coast of Northern California that was created quickly 56 million years ago and was accreted or docked onto the Pacific Northwest coastline about 50 million years ago. Only the southern tip of Vancouver Island has Siletzia material. Everything else is Baja, BC, as I understand it, on Vancouver Island. That's another thing Jerome can do. He can tell me when I'm not right. What do I have here? Right, Stewart Range, okay. So one of the main messages from last time is that we have in Washington a chalice magma story, where we have these unusual shallow magmas that have unusual chemistries, gold associated with them, it's crustal extension, and there's something called the Straight Creek Fault, which we devoted a live stream to. That's the Straight Creek Fault is a strike-slip fault that was basically initiated by the accretion of Silesia. So both the chalice magmas and the Straight Creek Fault are happening roughly the same time. If you're already overwhelmed, please don't be. You can do your homework and watch past live streams, but for right now, I'm leading to something and I hope that you'll see it. And then starting 44 million years ago, we set up the Cascades 44 and we still have them today. Now, he goes to the other whiteboard. It's raining a little bit, interesting. So I had this idea about an hour ago. I don't know if it works for you. One major message is we have a similar story in many respects once we get into BC. So obviously this is British Columbia, this is Washington, as I understand it. Now, of course, there's tons of exceptions of tons of other stories, but if we take Sunday's live stream and continue thinking about that kind of idea, is there Baja BC in BC? Of course there is. It's Baja frickin' BC, man. And Rangelia is a name for one of the major terrains that now is present-day Vancouver Island. British Columbia has an advantage that they have older exotic terrains, that were accreted more than 100 million years ago. I'll show you some images to get a sense of that and where those exotic terrains are located, called Quinella. There's Taquinia in there, which I don't understand. I don't know. I guess I lump it with Quinella. Notice that the chalice magma story does exist in British Columbia by a different name, the Kamloops. The Kamloops, eh? The Kamloops magmas. And the Straight Creek Fault, as soon as it crosses the border, becomes the Fraser Fault. And then they have cascades just like we have cascades. I don't want to do they and we. We're all in this together, right? Can't we all get along? Can you see that I've put the trench where the Juan de Fuca plate is subducting, and there's a smaller plate to the north. Can't even remember the name of it. That's how much I know. But we do have cascade volcanism crossing the border. The only mountain I know is Garibaldi. I'm sure there's other cones that are part of that story. I mean, I'm running out of information already. If you're waiting to pounce on me and say this guy's an idiot, I agree. I'm an idiot. I'm totally an idiot tonight. I got no problem with that. I want to learn from you. I want to learn from you. Let me give you some things I printed out at school today. Just maps, illustrations that caught my eye that pretty much work with what I just showed you. Hang on, Patrick. I'm always teasing Patrick when I say that, okay? I said that once, and now it's part of the shtick. I'm not picking on you. I know that you're there. It's just kind of fun to say, hang on, Patrick, every time. Or sorry, Patrick, when I say a bad word. Okay, so this is going to be scattered on purpose because pages are flying, number one, but I'm just trying to throw a bunch of things out there that interest me, and I'm hoping that you'll have things that interest you that either fit into these themes that I'm working out and that I'm kind of tossing out here, or a completely different approach. So even though we have not yet found, and maybe never will found, a master strike-slip fault, a master transform plate boundary that does the Baja Sea movement for us, and in fact it may be a culmination of hundreds of smaller strike-slip faults that have a cumulative effect of sending all this material north. And this involves the Nanaimo group and a bunch of other local units in southern British Columbia that have, well, not just southern British Columbia, even up in southeast Alaska, there's evidence of Baja BC transport. But I feel I've always meant to include this, and I guess now's the time. Have you heard of a guy named Bob Hildebrand? Robert Hildebrand. He makes beautiful maps, but it's way more than maps. He's an outside-the-box guy. Robert Hildebrand. Have you seen this? Bob Hildebrand, who talked to me on the phone for about an hour 2 years ago when I was deep into his stuff, he says, "You're looking in the wrong place." Yeah, Baja, BC, it's way more than just a little chunk of crust that's on the west coast that's moving north 2,000 miles. You've got to look bigger. And he's got specifics here up in BC, and then he's got similar units down in the south. I just wanted to include that. What is up with the weather tonight? We continue with freelancing for 1,000. This is potpourri for 1,000, Alex. Speaking of Canadians, Norm MacDonald, Alex Trebek, Joni Mitchell, Martin Short, all favorites of mine. Here are some significant provinces within the British Columbia province, so kind of physiographic provinces, that tell specific stories. We don't have time, nor maybe I have the interest to get into it, and one reason we don't is you just saw this nice, beautiful map. You're like, well, that's not too hard. Let's do it. Boom, 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 boom. Let's do it. Let's do them. One in a row. Well, if you give Bob Hildebrand the stage, boom, 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 boom. Wow. And look at how boring the German chocolate cake is. It's covering a bunch more of this wildness. Bob Hildebrand, Hildebrand, I guess, Robert. Got a bunch of special papers, etc. Now here's young Nicky Zentner 2 years ago with his colored pencils, drawing things out like Charlie Brown. Just trying to make cartoonish sense for myself. And there are, it's a name problem. Not only are we changing names when we cross the border of similar things, you've got different names within half a state or even county to county half the time. But I was looking for consensus among exotic terrain material in California, in the Klamaths of Oregon and Northern California, in the Blue Mountains of Northeastern Oregon, and then some of these features up in British Columbia. And you're like, well, why don't you connect the dots? Well, you lose it. You got too much lava and other things on top making those connections. This is the kind of thing that I'm looking for. I'm looking for ways to stitch narratives between distant places. In other words, I do want to learn British Columbia geology, but really I think I want to learn it as a way to extend the narratives or what I think are interesting things down here closer to home. Within a 2-hour driving radius of Ellensburg, I'm pretty comfortable. But I get north of Chelan and I'm lost. Actually, literally lost, and then I'm also not with it academically, geologically. And I'd love sometimes if you get that broad of a kind of a field of view, some connections are made that aren't made before. And forget about the fact there's impressive collections of Canadian geologists, impressive collections of US geologists, and I don't think there's a whole lot of work back and forth. I may be ignorant to that, but it feels like it's a missed opportunity in many cases for a bunch of reasons. Here's the Fraser Fault, which south of the border is the Straight Creek Fault. Same fault, same basic story. This is a major strike slip fault that was active between roughly 50 and 35 million years ago. And you can see some older faults on the east side of the Straight Creek Fraser Fault And you can see those same faults on the west side, so they've been offset 100 miles. We've talked about this before, but I'm telling you that it's not just a Washington story. It continues on. Weird session, isn't it? I'm just kind of randomly showing you stuff. Oh, I meant to show you this to start with, so I'll do it now. What the heck? We're really scrambling. So, like Washington, Oregon, California, and all of British Columbia, not there during Pangea time. So, like Washington, British Columbia is built from scratch in the last 200 million years. But those older terrains that accreted, I know very little about, primarily because those older terrains, the Quinellia stuff, not even sure I'm pronouncing it right, Quinellia, the blue and the yellow were accreted long before Baja, BC. And I don't know where that stuff came from. I mean, if you look at a program from 20 years ago or more, they ignore Baja, BC. They just say stuff came in off of the ocean. No discussion of where they came from, but they know that they're exotic to North America. Okay, that's kind of what I was taught in grad school. I was reading papers by Monger and Coney, these Xeroxed papers out of some book from 5 years earlier. But we now know that a bunch of the terrains that are younger than this, in other words, that were accreted younger than this time, came from the south, didn't come from distant places. But these older terrains, there's some that came through the Arctic. I don't have any more than, there's a few terrains that have been proven to have used to exist north of Scandinavia and came through the Arctic and arrived in British Columbia. Now it does seem like I'm making it up. What else do I have here before we turn it over to you? Oh, it's 6:30. Yeah, it's probably time to go to you. Here's another Bob Hildebrand map. Aren't they beautiful? They're just pleasing, number one. And I want you to notice he picked a purposely boring color, I think, because it's boring. If you're wanting to look at Mesozoic rocks, if you're wanting to look at these terrains that came from distant places and were added to the western edge of old North America, you're not going to the Snake River Plain, you're not going to eastern Washington, because it's all buried in miles of lava. But there's a few places within the German chocolate cake where you have little glimpses of stuff that's definitely down there. We just don't have any information. But go to British Columbia. Go to British Columbia and it's all there. It's not buried in a major way. I think it is buried in certain places. I think that's probably enough. I will just spitball a couple other things verbally that are just scraps of what people have told me about or I've read about involving British Columbia. And then I'll just be very curious where we go with this. Okay? Okay? Potpourri, another round. Oh, the Burgess Shale. Go to Yoho National Park. Stephen Jay Gould. The Cambrian explosion, Burgess Shale. That's part of British Columbia geology. Radium Hot Springs. Kootenai National Park. Interesting area. The source of the Columbia River. Got to go there. There's a bunch of flood basalts in the interior plateau of British Columbia. Is that true? Are they the same age as the Columbia River basalts in eastern Washington? You'd think I'd know that. I don't. I've had a bunch of people talk to me about that. Is there a hot spot up there? Is there a hot spot track for the flood basalts, if there are flood basalts in central BC? How many active stratovolcanoes are there on the Canadian side of the border? Is it more than Garibaldi? Do they behave differently somehow? Is there a different frequency for those eruptions than what we have? Probably not. There's a major strike slip fault. The Denali fault comes through and it's got a Canadian name. What is it? Queen Charlotte Island Fault or something? Big earthquake in 1949. I didn't even look it up. I think that's a date. Our oldest kid, Max, who's in Beirut right now, was a big climber when he went to school in Western Washington University. He said, oh yeah, we go up to Squamish all the time. Dad, you got to get up to Squamish. You've never been up there, have you? I'm like, Squamish, what are you talking about? I said, the most beautiful granite you've ever seen. It's one of my favorite places, Squamish. Get up there. Okay. Still haven't done it. And on and on and on. So, that's enough. That's enough of me. I'm going to get my laptop. I'm happy to go any way you want, but I want to remind you of the themes. Questions that I probably cannot answer, but Jerome or somebody else who knows a few things might be able to answer, and I can just look for a couple of answers and repeat them, read them to the group. Tips from those that are in the know about must-see things in British Columbia, and we'll just go from there. Looking forward to this. And if you tuned in for a full lecture on British Columbia geology, I apologized initially, and I apologize again. I was hoping that a title of a lecture with a question mark in it was a tell that I was going to be asking more than I was going to be lecturing. I don't like that term anyway, lecturing. Okay, I'm going to scroll like a madman here. I'm popping out the chat, live chat like a boss. I'm going to be on my game here the best I can. You said Moto Mining. You said, and Moto's, I think, from British Columbia. You said the Leech is a reverse fault. There's a lot of slate there. Is it from the ocean floor? I hear a lot of talk about the Leech River Fault or the Leech Fault, the southern portion of British Columbia. I assume it's a major structural boundary between the Crescent Formation, which is Silesia basalt, and much older Baja BC crust. Maybe we'll get some folks weighing in. I don't know about the slate there. If there is slate, I guess it's Baja slate. I don't know, this will be fun. I can have geologists who know what they're talking about correct me in real time. I'm a big boy. I'm looking forward to that. So Jeff says, so Glacier National Park to Jasper is all sedimentary. Where did Idaho Arc erupt? Thank you, Jeff. So if we go back to the earliest days of this map geologically, I am confident in that. The Belt Supergroup in Montana, which is incredibly thick, thousands of miles thick, of originally sedimentary beach rocks that are now kind of metamorphic sedimentary rocks, extend all through the Canadian Rockies. So yes, you can think of mostly stacks of almost Grand Canyon-like sedimentary layers. In places they're metamorphosed a little bit. In places there are major thrust faults. Again, I'm more familiar on our side of the border, the Lewis overthrust, which takes a big section of sedimentary rocks in Glacier National Park and shoves them miles, tens of miles to the east during the Laramide orogeny when the Rocky Mountains were forming. A major question mark, by the way, in my mind. What is the story with the Rockies? They're happening roughly at the same time as the Kamloops magmas. I don't understand the connection there. But yes, I would think of it as basically all sedimentary, and then pockmarked within that scene are these magmas sporadically from the quote-unquote Idaho Arc, which I assume it continues. I haven't thought of that until right now. Those Idaho Arc volcanoes I was talking about, where we have present-day Sawtooth Mountains of Idaho, I think they swing. I think there's some batholiths that work their way through this portion of British Columbia that have that age and that signature, but you could sense my confusion there. So I keep moving. Barry, is the Okanagan River and Lake Okanagan a fault line? from the addition of land to BC. Well, this will be interesting. How do I deal with these questions I have no idea about? I'll just keep scrolling and looking for a little bit of help from somebody. Everybody's on the honor system here. We don't have any BSers here, thankfully. My guess, Barry, is that these major fault lines that are boundaries between terrains are so old that they're not influencing where rivers are flowing today. And I mainly say that because I'm pretty confident in Washington we don't have drainages that are following old terrain boundaries. There's so much time between sewing those terrains together and developing drainages. I'm not 100% confident to that, but that's my gut feeling. Okay, I saw you, Patrick, and then we have the automatic scroll. Did the Columbia River change course in British Columbia lots of times too? Are most of the BC rivers older than their ridges? Thank you, Patrick, age 6. You're remembering, Patrick, our discussion of the huge germaline chocolate cake, the huge Columbia River basalt, flood basalts that are pushing the Columbia River this way and that. I don't know of major flood basalts in BC that did that same kind of pushing the Columbia around. And because the upstream portion of the Columbia are in the Rocky Mountains, that's an older mountain range. Hadn't thought about that till right now, Patrick. So my hunch is no. My hunch is that the Columbia was not pushed around a bunch. There is a weird part in BC where the Columbia is like flowing north and like a few miles nearby it's flowing south. If you look at a map of the uppermost reaches, I mean, I could do a thing on David Thompson coming down the Columbia. Thank you, Patrick. Bill, so the Canadian ice sheet melts. This sheet was bounded on the east by the Northern Rockies and mountains on the coast of British Columbia. Is there evidence of major paleo lakes in British Columbia? There has to be, Bill. And I like your thinking. I hadn't thought of it that we've got major mountains bounding the deepest sections of the Cordilleran ice sheet, as I understand it. And so we kind of have this trough business already. Oh, that's something I wanted to comment on. What's the Rocky Mountain Trench? And what's the Tintia Fault? Tintia Fault? I mean, for a while, that I'm pronouncing it incorrectly, I'm sure, that I'm going to say Tintintia Fault because I don't know how to say it otherwise. It's a major... Can I find that? Hang on. Hang on, Patrick. Maybe I can find it just to try to pronounce it and sound it out. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm really scattered. There's a bunch of volcanic centers in British Columbia that are erupting during the Ice Age. I mean, considerable, more than just a couple of volcanoes that are erupting underneath the Cordilleran ice sheet. And so we have Tuyas and we have other volcanic centers that clearly were dealing with ice. At this point, Jerome is like, how do I even step in here? This guy's, this guy's a wreck. Oh, I didn't even share with you the rest of the schedule this week, did I? I'm going to look just quickly for this. I don't understand what the Rocky Mountain Trench is. It's such an obvious topographic feature. Is it a strike-slip fault? Come on, where is that? By the way, barely cracked open. But Roadside Geology of Southern British Columbia I bought 3 years ago. Have kind of vaguely paged through looking at pictures. Geology of Southern Vancouver Island. I don't know much about Chris. I don't know if he's still with us, but he has an old video. I think that's him. That's quite soothing. I barely cracked these open, by the way. I've had these for a few years. They've been collecting dust. This is a favorite of mine for the Washington side. And once you master some of this from Roland Tabor and Ralph Hagerud, and you're feeling confident, then you cross the border and try to follow those structures. This was sent to me by old Don up in the Okanagan on the Washington side. These guys have been, this is, I think, privately published. These guys have been the old fools. Jack Holden was just featured in the Seattle Times recently, this past Sunday. So they've been kind of in retirement, studying a lot of stuff, mostly glacially in the Okanagan. It's all on my to-do list. I can't find the... Can't find it. Rocky Mountain Trench, Tintintia Fault. I don't know what to do with those structures. That's about the best I can do, Bill. I'm praying now to see something from Jerome here, unless he's left in disgust. Why isn't Mount Garibaldi considered to be part of the Cascade Range? I think it is. That's new to me if it's not. Are they mapping the magnetic reversal record in the rocks to date these? There's lots of ways to date rocks now, Resort Dog. The paleomagnetism work that I think you're referring to helps position these terrains at a lower latitude, closer to the equator when they were created. But now there's way more evidence than just the paleomagnetic signature. If I'm gutsy enough, I'll do a session here on paleomagnetism. Because it keeps coming up, especially among folks who are not pleased with mainstream science. But there's plenty of basic things to cover that may be helpful for those who might have an open mind. Why didn't the Anaheim hotspot make a supervolcano, says Jack. Good question, Jack. I've never heard of the Anaheim hotspot. Is it in British Columbia? Or is it offshore now? Why are there so many hot springs in BC, asks Susan. Why are there so many hot spots in general? Hot springs in the Basin and Range province of Nevada and western Utah and southern Idaho make perfect sense to me. The crust has been stretched to have the crust be half as thick as it should be, and there's tons of normal faults, and so there's a lot of heat coming to the surface. But I've been here 30 years, I still don't understand why there's hot springs on the Olympic Peninsula, for instance. There shouldn't be a bunch of heat there. Go see Cruikshank Canyon in Strathcona Park, Vancouver Island. Will do. Thank you. Would love to share tips. You know, this is not just for me, of course. Hopefully this is for anybody who's looking for a road trip once things open back up. Are there Sierra Nevada mountains bent 180 degrees by the Pacific Plate movement north? Wayne, bent 180 degrees. No evidence of that. On Sunday, we're going to talk about the San Andreas Fault, and there's an animation by Tanya Atwater. We are taking crust and doing what you're describing, but the entire Sierra Nevada mountains, no. Is Whistler and Blackcomb Ski Resorts volcanic mountains? Is Whistler on the slopes of Garibaldi? If yes, then it's a volcano. I don't know Blackcomb. Is that nearby? This is more humiliating than I thought it was going to be. Let's continue. Oh, God. I should start drinking that wine. Is there a basin and range feature in British Columbia? I think so. I've heard from a number of people, I don't think I've read much about it, but if you get into central British Columbia, there's extension, there's volcanism that's quite young and appears to have a similar accordion opening that we have down south of the Snake River Plain. Need to follow up on that. Jerome, where are you? I need some help here. Split basalt at McMillan Provincial Park. Thank you, Joni. Split basalt, that sounds interesting. Maybe I need to scroll. Oh, I'm 15 minutes behind here. Let me keep scrolling. I'm glad there's so many questions. I'm back to 9:30 here. Sorry, I'm back to 6:33. I know of no obvious hotspot in British Columbia. I'm going to continue to scroll, though. Maybe we've got some answers coming. Now I'm getting excited. Hopefully these are the initial questions before people have answers that can chime in. Penny says, British Columbia has lots of minerals, exotic terrains, question marks. You can develop mineral deposits in many different situations, regardless of exotic terrain or not, Penny. So I wouldn't tie the mineral resources specifically to exotic terrains, although many of them are connected that way. Helen, does anyone know of any must-see things on the way up to Princeton, British Columbia from Seattle? I'm happy to just be a reader here if you've got questions for the group and they are not able to see the live chat. Sandy says, Mission Hill Winery built into an extinct volcano in Kelowna. Wonderful. Extinct volcano in Kelowna. So I'd be curious, is it an Ice Age volcano? Chasm Provincial Park is something to see. Thank you, Eric. Calval Girl. Is Baja, BC the same as Rangelia? I think of it as the same. There's good evidence that a majority of Vancouver Island was originally in Mexico. Pretty confident of that. Mount Meager, says John, northwest of Whistler. Eric says, will you do more of these? It's good to branch out and expand your horizons. Thank you, Eric. I needed, that was a timely statement. Thank you very much. Makes me feel a little bit better. I'm starting to regret doing this, so that feels good. Thanks. Are the Princess Charlotte Islands similar to Silesia, and was it created by craters of the moon? This is Queen Charlotte Island? Is there something different called Princess Charlotte Island? I know of the Denali Fault that maybe merges into the Queen Charlotte Fault or something. That's a major transform plate boundary, basically a northern version of the San Andreas Fault. And so I assume this is terrain material that's been shifted north. Wow. A lot to learn. What is the fault going up the Alberni Inlet called? Or what fault is it part of? Thank you, Foxy. Maybe we can get an answer for you. How much thrusting of the docked exotic terrain shortening, says Mark. Well, that's an interesting question. If you watch in a relatively basic exotic terrain presentation, they have major portions of BC coming in at once, cartoonishly. And in that sense, if you're accreting something the size of Madagascar or bigger, then I don't think you're doing much shortening. But if it's truly a piecemeal thing, where you have a bunch of little volcanic island arcs and other scraps of things that are being thrust up on, then my gut says you are shortening things quite a bit. Lyle says, yes, Mission Hill on Mount Boucherie, an ancient volcanic plug. Ank 5402, my favorite Squamish feature are the glacial striations directly across from the Chief, which is a giant granite face. Thanks for doing this from a BC science teacher. Well, thank you for the comment. You should be teaching this right now. Gord, folded mountains. I say when I was very young, it would be interesting to hear their story. Folded mountains. Is that a place, Folded Mountains? Gracie, age 10, thank God. Ask, is there Baja BC terrain in Alaska or did it stop in British Columbia? Gracie, thank you for your question, age 10. The only time I've been in Vancouver, I guess I went twice. I drove up to just check out them building the Olympic grounds, whatever year that was. Was that 2010? That was winter, I just needed to get out of town. But the only other time I really spent time in the city of Vancouver was at a Geological Society of America meeting. I forget what year. And I sat in some sessions where these guys are talking about terrains up north of Juneau, Alaska, that were in Baja, Mexico. And I'm like, wow, I thought telling the story about Mount Stewart being down in Baja was a tough one. There's stuff as far north as southeast Alaska that has growing amounts of field evidence to confirm that stuff was in Baja. Wow. So it wasn't just British Columbia that was doing that movement. Jerome's hanging me out to dry here. Still at 6:35. I'm almost 20 minutes behind. Can we summarize the volcanism in British Columbia? How many active volcanoes? I would like somebody to do that before we quit, Jamie. Somebody who knows about volcanism in British Columbia. Can you give us a couple sentences about the Cascade volcanism story in BC? And then I'm wondering if you can give us a couple more sentences about what I assume is far older volcanism. But I guess now that I say that, there's also these Pleistocene volcanic centers as well. I can't hold it. In the summer of 1925, Bretz, I'm back to Bretz now, was with a few graduate students from the University of Chicago. And he had already spent 3 summers here, 1922, 1923, 1924, and he'd mapped all this flood stuff. And he needed a source for his floods. And apparently, although I haven't seen the journals, he spent the entire summer of 1925 looking for Ice Age volcanoes that provide the heat to melt a bunch of ice to create the water for his floods. This is before he, I guess, agreed with Pardee about Glacial Lake Missoula. But he spent weeks, maybe months, I don't know where, in BC with some students on horseback or walking, or maybe he had his old Dodge Squareback by that point, but he didn't find much. He didn't find what he needed. He didn't find a source. But there are volcanic centers that were underneath the ice at one time. Jeffrey, how was terrain of Inside Passage created? Now, the Inside Passage, as I understand it, is a common, you take the ferry, like you're a retired person, you got a little retirement money, we're going to take a cruise, we're going to go up through the Inland Passage. I'm offending a bunch of people, sorry. And we're going to, go see the glaciers at Glacier Bay, etc. As I understand the Inside Passage, is that what it's called? It's just a function of sea level. Like I wonder if there was an Inside Passage during the last glacial maximum, where you lower sea level by hundreds of feet. I should stop there. I don't know what I'm talking about even with that. Mark says, can I discuss the Stikine volcanic belt? Now, I haven't heard about that name until recently. Yukon in eastern Canada, the Stikine volcanic belt. I wish I could. Jerome, 635. Thanks for the hat. Wrangellia extends to Alaska. It's called the Alexander Terrain. Thank you. Frederick, did Baja BC pass over Juan de Fuca? Did it pass over Juan de Fuca? No, Frederick. We had a totally different... Daddy's getting wet now. He can handle it. Hang on. Hang on, Patrick. Protecting the laptop. Frederick, if you haven't, please go to Sunday's live stream where we're talking about something called the Kula Plate, which was a large oceanic plate that used to be offshore heading north during the time of Baja BC. So we did not have the Juan de Fuca Plate at that time. And you're right, we can't really do Baja BC. We can't move a bunch of stuff thousands of miles north if we have an ocean plate that's coming at us. We need an ocean plate that's actually going to be helping transport pieces of crust north. Thanks for the question. Sandstone in Princeton, BC. Can somebody help? What is the origin of Queen Charlotte Island, Baja BC or Silesia? I don't think there's any Silesia in BC except the southern tip of Vancouver Island. So probably part of Wrangellia is my guess. Mount Meager had a monster landslide several years back. Thank you, John. Several years back? Wow. Michael, where did Vancouver Island come from? Mexico is the simple answer. Have you heard that before? There's lots of slate. So here's somebody else talking about slate on Vancouver Island. How much is volcanic? Well, slate is a mud rock that becomes shale and then it becomes slate, a metamorphosed mud, basically. So I wouldn't connect that to volcano, Foxy. But I didn't realize slate was a major portion of Vancouver Island. Possibly Jerome can weigh in there. Gail, are San Juan Islands part of Baja BC or Silesia? Definitely Baja BC, Gail. We did a 5-minute PBS program on Deception Pass. And we shared the work of Darrell Cowan at the University of Washington. And he has great evidence that much of the San Juan Islands was in Baja, Mexico. Did the funky scroll thing, trying to go back. It's at 7 o'clock. I just need to do a few more of these. Hopefully you can read all these questions and comments. Uh-oh, Jerome's chiming in now. Oh, we got Jerome. It's a Jerome Fest suddenly. What's with the rain? This wasn't in the forecast. Jerome says lots of ghost volcanoes. The better part of the interior of the province has volcanoes. I think I'm going to hope that if you're watching this in replay form, you can read Jerome's replies to people. Jerome, I really appreciate you helping us out here, man. Now I'm just reading. Now I'm just reading. Let's do a couple more. We're in the cozy fort unexpectedly. It's raining pretty good out here. Bornite Mountains in British Columbia, north of Idaho. I'm just going to randomly read a couple of these things. Are bugaboos part of the Idaho Batholith group? That's an interesting spot that we drove right by. I wanted to stop, but we didn't. More questions about supervolcanoes in BC. Jerome answers, Alberni Inland Fault and Manu, others, have been accentuated by glacial erosion. Yeah, that's kind of, I don't know. Let me scroll down to real time. Oh, God. Okay, I'm down with you right now. I'm going to ask, if Jerome is still with us, I'm going to ask you, Jerome, to can you write a few sentences, Jerome, about shit, how can I do this? Sorry, Patrick. I was wondering if we could do some Ice Age stuff here as well. Especially, that's Jerome's specialization, is working with deposits that are viewed more as drumlins sheared by moving water, as opposed to the old view of drumlins being sheared by ice or shaped by ice. Jerome says, Ice Age, let's go. So let me ask you this, Jerome. Well, this will work. Now, I think it's maybe just me and Jerome here for just a couple minutes, if you don't mind. Jerome, what can we view this summer in British Columbia that are landforms that prove to you and to many that meltwater was flowing underneath the ice? What do those landforms look like? Is it just eskers, which are rather small features? Where can we go to find evidence of a bunch of water heading to Washington that was under the ice? Yeah, so if Jerome's writing a little bit here, I'll just stall for a second. You're all suggesting doing Zoom and other things, and that's interesting. I don't know how to do that with this setup with the YouTube channel. But this is, I've learned so much about using technology here. Jerome says Okanagan Valley itself is possibly one of those very large channels. Interesting. So if we're driving up the Okanagan Valley, Jerome, what are we looking at? Are we looking in the floor of the valley? Are we looking at the margin, the sides of the valley? What to you about Okanagan Valley says water? In the meantime, Jerome says Omak Lake area is the extension of the valley and the channels. Now that's interesting. The Omak Lake is in Washington, near the little town of Omak, of course, on the Colville Reservation. And it's always been a puzzle to me, although I've never really gone up to study it very much. So it could be simply looking at something like Omak Lake and asking yourself, is this high velocity water? Or is this ice cutting grooves into the bedrock? I'm not. So yeah, I think I asked Jerome if you could comment on the Okanagan Valley details in addition to Omak Lake. Is there another key spot or two that if you had a van full of us driving up the Okanagan Valley where you would point and say, hey, how do you explain that if we don't have a bunch of water underneath the Cordilleran ice? And I had another thought for Jerome. Hang on before I forget it. What was it? Oh, yeah. Cheryl, I'm glad you think this is fun. This is a weird one, isn't it? Great drumlins. So drumlins are, as I was taught, hills made out of glacial till that are kind of spoon-shaped. There's usually kind of a tail going to the south and the north side of the hill. In other words, the farm I grew up on in Wisconsin was a drumlin. There's drumlins all over southern Wisconsin. So Jerome says there's great drumlins south of Merritt, British Columbia, and they might have characteristics of water erosion. So we're going back to me learning first about drumlins. in southern Wisconsin, a classic place for drumlin fields. They're literally called drumlin fields. And I was taught in the early 80s by some of the advanced guys, Dave Michelson and others at the University of Wisconsin. These are deposits from the ice themselves, and the ice is flowing over these hills called drumlins, and they are smearing this till down ice and making these tails. And Michelson was up in Alaska every summer with graduate students, and they were trying to kind of find modern examples of that. Well, now Jerome, and I assume his former advisor John Shaw, I think I have that name right, and perhaps others in Jerome's camp, the polka dot hat in the field, that's right, from Dave Michelson, that was his trademark. And I'm really interested in learning about drumlins and viewing them a different way. And that's really John Shaw and his former graduate students, including Jerome, saying, maybe you're using a fire hose and all this water is taking most of the till away, and we're left with these hills as erosional remnants, as opposed to these little spoon-shaped cookie dough things we're dropping out of the ice and then sculpting it. I hope this makes sense to you, but that's a crucial question here, because if it truly is incredible amounts of water coming down the Okanagan, of course, that changes our view of how you form Moses Coulee, let's say, in central Washington. We're going to wrap it up this way. Hey, Jerome, you got some, I'll just ask it. How many days in the field did you spend with Randall Carlson? And what did he want to see? And do you think he listened to you? I get asked a lot about a gentleman by the name of Randall Carlson, and many of you here right now might be regular listeners to his presentations. And Jerome says he spent 4 days in the field with Randall Carlson looking at drumlins in bedrock channels. Has Randall Carlson invited you to join him on a podcast, Jerome, maybe with Joe Rogan? And if he has, are you going to be joining him? Amen. Joe Rogan doesn't have a cozy fort. We get that. I mean, this is the big time, obviously. Go Bears. Jerome says, yes, on his podcast, we've talked about it, and it's in the works. On Carlson's podcast or Joe Rogan's podcast? For those that are viewing right now and unaware, Joe Rogan is a guy who has an incredible following with his programs, and he covers the gamut. On Carlson's podcast, says Jerome. Okay. So I'm hesitating here because I get asked a lot about Randall Carlson, and he has a very specific narrative to share. And from what I've heard from Randall Carlson, it doesn't work age-wise with the data the careful data that's been collected by Vic Baker and everybody else. We'll bring it back to how we started this. There's been a number of field geologists who've worked their whole careers out in the eastern Washington channeled scablands and have worked out the timing of floods and dates of floods, and none of that works with what Carlson is talking about. And yet he keeps pushing this narrative, and it's confusing to me why he connects his stories with eastern Washington. And him going to reach out to a guy like Jerome, who has done extensive field work and has taught his whole career, is a good move. And I hope that Jerome is able to given more of an opportunity to speak, as opposed to this clown show where he's typing in from home. Jerome, thank you for joining us. Hope we can do this road trip this summer. And for the rest of us, a toast to you, and let's look at the schedule for the rest of the week. For better or for worse, that was British Columbia. Huh? Geology. Tomorrow night, a special guest, Andrew Sadowski from the Washington Geological Survey, will be dodging the raindrops and the wind out here in the backyard. He lives in town, and he will be sharing how you make geologic maps in the field in the 21st century. I'm not in the 21st century, and so I'll share my 20th century techniques, and then we'll turn it over to Andrew. Looking forward to that. Thursday, field trip over to Wenatchee, hiking and talking about Wenatchee geology. Saturday, special guest, a very special guest from Wenatchee, live. And Sunday morning, the San Andreas Fault in California. Let's find some of that wine. Wine glass from Brisbane, Australia. Thank you again, Kathy. Pieces of red wine from Lake Roosevelt, Columbia River. Gifford, was it? Washington, from Susan. So appreciate your generosity, Susan, and the generosity of all of you. Just the generosity of your time. Here's to you for spending time with us for each of these live streams. Here's to all of us trying to learn new things. Whether you look ridiculous doing it or not, it's all about trying to stretch yourself, learn new things, branching out, not being afraid to be a little vulnerable once in a while. And of course, here's to your health. Here's to the health of your parents and your grandparents, all your family and friends, and our continued hope to offer love, support, acceptance, and respect to all of us around the world. Thanks for joining us tonight. Hope you enjoyed it. I'm looking forward to reading your comments and questions more carefully in replay form. And we'll see you in 24 hours back here in the backyard. Good night from Ellensburg, Washington, USA, and Nanaimo, Vancouver Island, from Jerome Lessman's house. I love you all. Goodbye.